Hey, Changemaker! Welcome to Rethink Social Change podcast, a show dedicated to helping social change practitioners improve the way they make change happen to achieve tangible and sustained impact. I'm your host, Ratiba Sharif. I've worked with some of the world's leading social change organizations for more than 2 decades on 4 continents to help them design better projects, learn from them, and measure their results. Using Rethink Social Change cards, I will challenge changemakers like yourself to share their experience on what worked, what didn't, and why, in a very unique way. I will shuffle the deck of 54 Rethink Social Change cards and randomly draw 4 cards that will guide our conversation. So if you're ready for unscripted, jargon-free stories from the field, let's dive into today's episode. Hey, Changemaker. Welcome to the first episode of Rethink Social Change. Let me introduce the brave guest who accepted the challenge. Soledad Muniz is Director of Programs at InsightShare. She hails from Argentina and resides in London with her 2 children and husband. InsightShare empowers people by giving them and training them to use video cameras as tools for transformative change. With over 2 decades of experience, Soledad has spearheaded over 30 projects across the world, addressing critical issues such as the environment, indigenous rights, gender equality, and youth advocacy. I worked with her on the UNICEF Education and Peacebuilding project in Western Central Africa, where we use participatory video and most significant change to evaluate outcomes of projects. She's one of the world's experts that merges community empowerment, research, and evaluation. Let's welcome her in. Hi, Soledad. So nice to have you.
Lovely to see you, Rativa. Thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. You're very courageous too. For accepting the challenge. You're the very first to go. I know you really enjoy participatory interactive tools for engaging participants in thinking about what they do.
Yes, totally. And your cards are definitely part of that. So I was super excited to do a conversation using them. Yeah.
Okay, that was yesterday.
Yeah. The other day I brought them into a team meeting and everybody enjoyed them. And I think it's help you focus and dig deeper and not kind of go off track in conversations. Sometimes even bring in issues that otherwise you wouldn't have brought because you get carried away on other things. So yeah, definitely people enjoy using them.
Oh, I'm so glad. That's what they were made for. So you know them. I'm going to show them to you again. So we have 54 cards. And the way the conversation is going to work is that I am going to select 3 cards randomly from the deck. And then I'm also going to select another card to help us, what I call a trump card, to help us dig deeper later in the conversation. I will not show you the trump card. So if you're ready, I'm just going to start shuffling and randomly pick the cards that will guide our conversation.
Yes, please.
In the intro, I mentioned that you worked for InsightShare and you've worked quite extensively using participatory videos and in evaluation projects.
Yes.
So that's really cool, and I'm guessing that that's the experience you're gonna use to talk about.
Yes, mostly. I think participatory media.
All right,
is.
So let me take the card. 1 card, 2 cards. They're all facing down, and 3 cards. I'm gonna show them in a minute, put these on the side and get my trump card. And that one is going to be this one. I'll put it here and put the others there. Let's see what the cards are. Okay. All right. So we have, in terms of context, we have the geographic context of the places you work in.
Yeah.
So here, this card is inviting you to talk about access, density of population, borders, etc. All right. So that's our first card. Our second card, which is a people's card, i.e. stakeholder card, is talking about people in the field, offices in the field. These, in your case, I know you don't have field offices, but you work with field offices of different clients.
Yeah.
So that's one to think about.
Yeah. Totally.
All right. And the last card is as a resource card, and it's time.
Great.
Okay.
the
So it's
duration
about
of frame.
duration, etc. So my very first question is, what do they bring up in terms of experience? What are the ideas that come up with these three cards?
I think they're really exciting in the sense that field offices is something that for us is really important wherever we work. So that's
Mhm,
why, despite context, I was thinking what is specific to context and what is despite context. So engagement of local staff,
mhm,
either from civil society organizations, part of a project, or big NGOs,
mhm,
national or international ones. The staff who deals directly with the project is really important. So any work we do on participatory M&E
mhm,
has to involve all stakeholders. So we wouldn't do a project where we only would work with one stakeholder and all the other ones are kind of in the blind in the process, because we feel like that's not going to be conducive on learning, on accountability, and lots of other factors that is quite essential for learning to then be used.
yeah,
So utilization of any process in an evaluation. So we normally insist on what is called the local evaluation team to be formed of a combination of stakeholders, and
mhm,
that tends to be community members, representatives, sometimes are already playing a key role in a project, for example, youth leaders or young people being mentors to others, or community members acting as volunteers
mhm,
or field officers. So
mhm,
we start always with the community, then how that project is delivered. So sometimes it's delivered just by one organization, and many times is a partnership of two or three.
mhm,
For say, just to say an example, so we would ask that every partner sends one or two staff to do
mhm,
the process, and those are staff who are close to the delivery of the project. So either programmatic staff, or if it's M&E staff, it has to be staff who are not in an office on a computer, but normally visiting and interacting with communities in an ongoing basis.
mhm.
So that is really, really important, because in that way we feel the learning is almost utilized in real time
Yeah.
when people are going through the exercise, the activities, and the process. So
Mhm,
time is really an interesting card that came out
mhm,
there, because you may have certain time frames in terms of a typical process of project delivery, key
mhm.
moments of M&E, and where this exercise fits in
Yeah.
that. But at the same time, beyond the amount of days that you have for an activity, I always say the shorter the time in which people can reuse their learning, the better. So it's almost, even if it's not what is a traditional real-time evaluation or monitoring exercise, it allows for that participatory exercises because of the transparency and the use of the results really quickly through the
Mhm.
videos, rather than waiting 3-4 months for an approved report that has to pass through lots of layers of approval of lots of different people. Of course, there is space for that, but we feel that is not the only way in which you can store and disseminate learning. So
Mm.
it tends to be much more restrictive in terms of audience and use. So in that sense, we actually, I think field officers are really, really important. The other key thing I would say is that the facilitators from InsightShare tend to be a combination of expertise. So you have many times local staff, in the
Mhm,
sense that is facilitators that either are from that country or from that region that work
mhm.
with us over time, and others who may be international, like in any project based on skills. But more and more, we are working exclusively with our local and regional facilitators, with the international support being more remotely and less about traveling and playing an expert role in a project. So that's been quite an important shift that we wanted to play over the years, and I think the pandemic has accelerated it,
Right.
and we felt like that is really important. So
Mhm.
those two cards I think are easy. Context, I'm trying to think where to put the emphasis, but if I'm going to look at an example,
Remember,
yeah,
remember, it's geographic context, right?
exactly, it's geographic context.
So
So
so think rural, urban.
Yes.
In terms of decision making as well, access, where people are.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
those are the-
I think in terms of my experience of rural spaces, every location has its own complexities, and you can kind of put a stereotype on one or another. But I would say in rural spaces, we have had experiences where community members normally can participate more than in urban contexts, unless this is part of a long-term ongoing project. For example, we work in Sierra Leone, in Freetown, in a long-term project of urban development in with slum dwellers. So they were really integrated into program delivery, and they were really easily able to participate in participatory M&E.
right.
But in other contexts, I feel like in rural areas where maybe you work in villages, or of smaller amount of people, you can engage almost the whole village really quickly into activities. Um, for when we work with in context where it's more like the refugee context or humanitarian nexus with development,
Mm,
again, I think is depending on the layers that you have to get for approval. Whenever we work in a context that is a settlement that is more stable and people have been more integrated, it's easier the access than when it's a settlement obviously managed by the national government, and you have to pass a lot of layers of approval for what can be done, what cannot be done in those
right,
contexts. We
right.
have done it, and it's quite exciting, but also is really important in those cases, for example, not to underestimate the time that those approvals and those steps
Right.
take for everybody.
Mm,
We actually recently, last year, worked in a settlement like this in Uganda, and it worked really well, but it had enough time for planning for all of those not to be barriers, and actually to allow participation when all stakeholders are involved and everybody understands the purpose of this. Then the approvals get going much more than when suddenly they see a camera out of the blue. In
sure.
participatory media, in particularly photography, video,
Mhm.
any process with a camera, there can be a lot of misunderstandings in terms of why
Absolutely.
are you there with a camera, why the community is going around with a camera. So particularly making the distinction, this is not journalism, and it's really different. It's a community-led process for learning and for self-reflection and for actually informing better program design. So breaking all those stereotypes in conversations is important with enough time.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Um, Sule, thank you so much for this. And there's a lot actually to unpack, and there's so much that came out of just three cards, right? There's a distinction that I'd like you to clarify for me, because I know you use participatory video for M&E or for evaluation purposes and kind of iterative evaluations, but then you also use it as a tool for programming, as an
Yeah.
empowerment tool. Could you tell me the distinction between the two?
Yes.
And voila, and whether with regards, say, to your clients or your partners' field offices, does that change? Because evaluation would have a kind of an objectivity element to it, right?
Yes.
And so how does that? Yeah, could you speak to that a little bit?
Totally. So for evaluation, I would say majority of our work is for supporting people to do better internal M&E.
Mhm.
So when it's about supporting better internal M&E and more listening and better incorporation of people's perceptions into program design, then we definitely work with staff, because they are the crucial, programmatic or M&E staff, depending on the size of an organization, are the crucial gatekeepers for learning to be incorporated, and
Mhm.
sometimes obviously pass to any senior person who would take
Mhm.
design decisions. In the few occasions where we work in external evaluation, even when we work in external evaluation, we are part of victims, where obviously there may be a thematic lead and a lead consultant leading the evaluation, and
Did you
our
say
role
victims?
much
Sorry.
more a case study role.
Did you say victims?
No, as a
Oh,
lead evaluator. Oh, maybe the lack. No, as the lead principal consultant,
right,
basically
right.
they lead on the thematic analysis, but our work tends to be much more focused on the community. So it keeps being a participatory process. Sometimes they prefer just the community members to be leading the process and evaluating, but many times also implementers are really crucial. So we make a distinction for a case study format as part of external evaluation. There is no issue in involving the implementers in key roles, because actually leaving them out will not transfer learning.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we advocate for that as well. But in terms of our programmatic work that we work, for example, in supporting processes of advocacy, behavior change, sharing learning horizontally between communities, different processes. Definitely, the work is much more with program staff.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's with also communication staff when they are engaged in an advocacy campaign, for example, if they are responsible for that. But I would say, even though the profile of staff change,
Mm-hmm.
um, in M&E, because it's internal M&E, many times the ones doing internal M&E are program staff and not there are organizations who don't have enough staff
Mm-hmm.
just to be exclusively male, or the person who's exclusively male is in an international office, in headquarters, guiding, but the person doing all the work is a programmatic person in that country specifically. So I would say programmatic staff is the main area where we support. um, the other key thing I would say, for example, in humanitarian work, we are trying to work more and more connected, because a lot of the agendas are relating to community engagement and
Mm-hmm.
accountability. And really, if you do participatory mail, that's a really crucial way in which you can engage more people and be more accountable to them, and not necessarily, like in many other things in the sector, work in silos and think like, mail is one thing, programs is another thing, and accountability to people is another thing, and we will do that just with a feedback form.
Yeah.
No, actually, the best way in which you can be accountable, it is to better listen, and the way to better listen is if you connect the dots of the three. So when we
Mm-hmm.
do processes like that, we've supported in the past, for example, the Red Cross in Nepal. We train staff across all responsibilities. So it was a joint training between people doing community engagement, people doing delivery of programs, people doing mail, people doing comms, and then working together on how they're going to connect. When you do one process that is, in depth, properly listening to people, and making sure you're going to respond to whatever came up, you
Yeah.
can use the same process for everything. So when people telling me participation takes a lot of time, you were having the time card, I'm like, not really. It's much more about design. Are you
Mm-hmm.
designing it across? And even it can be cost effective if you're designing it across, because in one process you can do multiple things if people give you consent to use it for lots of different
Yeah.
purposes. So is to me, to do people center programs like today is kind of the latest way of calling it, or localization multiple times. It's just the same process. Is, are you doing genuine participation in whatever you are doing? I tick the box
Yeah.
exercise in the
And
process.
you brought up the you made the link between actually the time that it takes to do participatory, and sometimes it's actually, it is said that it's lengthy and people don't have time, etc. But actually what takes time is building trust, right? Because once you've built that trust, then it's very easy to replicate and build that trust and not lose it. So at every single moment of the process, that trust is being tested, right? And
Totally.
it can be lost at any moment, and then you can't recoup it. It's
But but
especially
but when
very,
they trust you, because they realize that they are in the driving seat, community
yes.
members in taking
Hmm.
decisions.
Hmm.
I will never forget one process that we shared in the past in Cote d'Ivoire, where 1 year later, young people that led a process and created videos post conflict election violence. They wrote to us on Facebook saying, "Hey, just with our pocket money, we went around the country doing screenings. We didn't tell
Uh-huh.
anybody. We didn't tell all the actors or the NGOs or the partners. We just did it out
Yeah.
of our own interest. And then they wrote a blog about it. We're like, you need to share this with the world. So I'm like, the key aspect of, to me, of engaging people first, obviously, is they are agents of their own life. And they're extremely resilient, but also is recognizing dignity that, when you put people at the driving seat, they will not just tell you what you should be doing better or what you are doing right as a civil society actor, but also they are going to, you don't have to underestimate what they can do by themselves, even if they
Absolutely.
tell you or not about it. And that's the whole point, in my view, on most participatory approaches, and in our case is participatory media, but it's really supporting that at the same time of strengthening civil society and improving social change programs, is also supporting and strengthening communities, because they are the ones driving the realities and the change in their own lives. So those kind of anecdotes, to me, show really what's possible. And it happened to me in other countries where, particularly in relation to peace building, people would say, oh, a few months later, I went around with a USB showing videos in, I don't know, all the churches or all the youth groups, because I thought it was important. So I think that is really crucial. And it wasn't something programmed or organized. It was the own intention of that young person in this case. So
So,
yeah.
so yeah, because there's this power of, and I've seen it, on the work that we did together on the peace building and education program in Côte d'Ivoire, notably. It's how, because it was on transitional justice, etc. It was amazing how these cameras empowered youth, how they felt to, the skills that they gained, but also that they could initiate new ways. And it opened up a world of possibilities.
Yes.
And it also positioned them, because you do public screenings, right? As you go along, you do public screening where people when used for monitoring and evaluation, or mostly evaluation, we use the most significant change, where you take the different videos collected and the community chooses the one that represents the most significant change. So that whole process empowers youth, and then they can be left with those, and they can go on and use either the products itself, the videos, as this youth did, going around the country and putting it in a USB stick. So it's very low tech, right? At the end. So it's that thing. This brings me actually, because you said, they went around in churches, etc. I wanted to know if there's a distinction that you've seen between urban and rural. Are there limitations both in terms of perspective of how they view participatory video, the use of video? You've worked with indigenous communities,
Yes.
because I know that image is sometimes very protected, because it's linked to some spiritual beliefs. So how did that work in very remote areas, and were there any operational problems as
Issues.
well?
Yeah, I would say urban, actually, if you work through established community groups,
Hmm.
is easier. It's harder when you have to set up a community
Okay.
to come together, because you will need more time to bring them together. We have work in a lot of cities, but when you are not working through established projects, long-term projects, like this example I was giving you in Sierra Leone,
Mhm.
um, where those groups are already there, and then they want to come and reflect on an issue that it has been happening long term, it's much harder to bring that cohesion, unless you are starting off a process, and then you are helping build that network. I
Mhm.
think in the geographic communities in rural contexts are easier, because of being geographic and much more about location than only maybe interests or other issues. With indigenous peoples, particularly, that we work long term, is much more about supporting them attain their rights, and that is this is one more tool in their toolbox to support them in affirming their culture and navigating the realities that they face. So in some contexts they use it much more to come together and have dialogue and understand each other better, because they are, even the communities that I visited, or some of my colleagues visited, that were really small, they still suffer from this technique that I think national governments, even democracies today have learned through the centuries with colonization of divide and rule. So that is really used across the world, no matter the government, to undermine indigenous rights to anything, to land, to the use of the language, to everything. So it's really easy to manipulate a group if they are not able to come together and have a joint common voice and
Right.
aspirations. So, for example, they have used a lot of participatory video for that, for better understanding, coming together, and then when they are stronger as a community, for example, using it to advocate on certain issues or to communicate to an outside world, to an international audience, the reality, or sometimes is to bring their perspective, which can be quite different on certain issues. For
Absolutely.
example, climate change or our relationship as humans to nature, or recently we worked 2-3 years ago with WHO, supporting them look at what healthy aging means for different older people around the world. And we supported an urban group in Jordan that was mixed of host community and refugees. Then an semi peri-urban group, peri-urban and rural in Togo, and then an indigenous community in Canada, looking at their really different perspectives of what healthy aging means to you, not just because of your context and your culture, but also based on your cosmovision of the world in the case of indigenous peoples, and of your traditions and values. Also to highlight to decision makers that, of course, traditional research is important in something like public health, but it has its limitations if you don't understand or listen to lived experience of peoples and their points of view of what could be to have a healthy aging life, not just defined by metrics or by policy standards. So it was a fascinating thing to witness, in that case, for kind of a joint voice, but at the same time each one highlighting different aspects based on their geographical context. But
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
for the other work we do with indigenous peoples is really they use the method in lots of different ways, as I was saying. A lot they have been using it to preserve their language. So we, for example, work with El Molo people in Kenya, where the language had almost disappeared, and they had only a few elders left in their community, and they started to record video dictionaries to save the language, and
As a
now
repository.
they are teaching the language with those videos to the children in the villages. So
Wow.
it's each group can decide how best to use the method to support them in their community development issues, basically.
This is just so fascinating. The applicability and the it's so versatile, and you can use it for different aims, right, and ends. It can give voice to those who feel that they were not given enough voice, more as an advocacy tool. It can actually be as a repository tool to, and I think increasingly this could be used. It's just fascinating. I'm just like so fascinated by what you can do, actually even
Yes.
more now than when we work together. And quite it's a great segue, because I picked a card that I didn't show you, and the one that came is champions. So it says, it's stakeholders who believe in the project and can help. So, and you've mentioned a few of how, the participatory process actually does identify and build champions. Can you speak a little bit to that, mostly with regards to, whether they can help you expedite things, like be entry points and kind of
Yes.
have more leverage to open doors, so to speak?
Yes.
If champions can also give you access to remote areas, or some that are not readily accessible to foreign kind of outfits, and then champions and field offices, because there are dynamics at play
Totally.
at some
Totally.
point. So voilà, speak to the one that.
Oh, that's great. So, in terms of, I'm going to start with the field offices because it's connected to the other two. I do think absolutely any process where you want to do genuine participation and listen for M&E, for advocacy, for any purposes, for accountability, you do need somebody who's championing it, ideally more than one person, but sometimes in some organizations, it's one individual that really believes in that vision, the importance of it. So I always say if that person is like middle to senior level, They'll have more leverage for all the other issues that you mentioned there and more blockages to kind of unlock them faster. When
Mhm.
they are medium to lower level, then they will have to build allies themselves if they don't already have them.
Yeah.
But in the cases where it's even middle to higher level, obviously if you
Mhm.
are like the country director, that's amazing. But I'm saying in the middle, if you're a project manager, a senior project manager, and you really see the value, then you can work it out around the structure.
Yeah.
It's really important. That's one of the key roles I work on, particularly when we start a project with somebody, beyond all the obvious things that you can put in a contractual process to protect participants, and that this is going to be a meaningful process. We don't do
Mhm.
tokenistic participation, so we only engage in process where we believe the organizations do want to listen and do want to take
Mhm.
people seriously. So
Mhm.
I spend time in getting to know people and helping them make it happen, because the whole point is that they brought us in as an ally to realize that vision.
Yeah.
So I do think these are extremely important, and that's to me something that perhaps happens in lots of other ways in civil society, and it should happen more explicitly. And capacity strengthening, we sometimes call it, sometimes it's called coaching. It doesn't matter the
Mhm.
label or the name, but to me it's like the importance of peer-to-peer support, no matter which organization you work for. When you are working on something together and working as peers and as equals, and not like trying to avoid power dynamics and issues that rather than help
Yeah.
hinder the work. Because at the end of the day, I always say those issues hinder what can happen differently and better with participants. So that's how we keep the perspective. So they are extremely crucial, I think, particularly I would say for how much the results are used,
Mhm.
utilization. And that's why it's really, really important that the interest and the vision is genuine, and they really want to move it through. uh, then on the access to, or the potential support they can give for accessing champions to access, or gatekeepers to access different
Mhm.
groups, that is also community members and not just um, um, NGO workers
Okay.
or
Mhm.
volunteers. Sometimes those volunteers are already community members, but if they are not, then we normally make that distinction. That's why, particularly for evaluation, is really important. We think really to engage community members as part of the local evaluation team, because they will see things differently in terms of their knowledge and their experience, but also in terms of access, and people feeling safe and trust to the team, and that this is going to be genuine. Because we also faced a lot of times people who have been, either they have total research fatigue, survey fatigue, because they've been asked 20 million times the same thing and nothing changed. We have also witnessed situations where, for advocacy purposes, somebody comes and films something and then extract that without consent, or people don't know how it's going to be used. So
Mhm.
lots of things that you want to avoid, and you want to make sure that they understand why this is happening, and them being fully on board in terms of if at some point they want to remove consent or question something, you need to
Right.
build that relationship, and for that you do need that trust through a gatekeeper, when
Mhm.
that's not direct access from the organization. And I always say also, if you do not have a community group in an evaluation, rethink how are you doing that in the program. Because if people
Mhm.
are not able to really come to an activity, sometimes it's not because you did that bad the planning. I had a few conversations like this with a lot of organizations saying, you're not reaching them at program level, why they're going
Mhm.
to trust you to come to an M&E activity.
Yeah.
So it also shows you something, and it's not necessarily a mistake from your M&E officer that didn't include them in the sample. It's because they
Okay.
don't trust you and you're not accessing them in implementation. Why are they going to come now? So that kind of conversation, quite honest, rather than um, just wanting to deliver something that is written up as a terms of reference, I
Right.
feel is extremely important. I would say, with your last point, which was so it was geographic, and time was the last
Mm.
one. I do think more than for speeding up is for pursuing, because
Mm.
I think the champions Some processes can be fast track for the timings of the civil society organizations, the pressure of funders, or the reality on that context.
Mhm.
Whatever can trigger that something has to be done fast.
Yeah.
But in other contexts, I witnessed the opposite, having to persist because those blockages, agreements with funders or agreements with your partners or with your line managers or access to the community, get delayed for lots of different purposes, and that you want to pursue and
Yeah.
you think is important and you don't want to give up, uh,
Okay.
despite the longevity that this is taking. If it's meaningful and if you're working in kind of in a long-term project,
Yeah.
no matter which sector, and I think that's really important to have that tenacity of kind of
Mhm.
going through the slow moments and keep pushing. Um, and again, we know that's not easy in a sector with high turnover. At
Mm.
least I would say up to national level NGOs, there is high turnover of people, except maybe in local partners where they work embedded in their organizations. So you do need to build that relationship so somebody will pursue it. And when somebody kind of pass on the baton, kind of transmits that to the next person, and that doesn't get lost. Ideally, that doesn't always happen, but that's the hope, or that's what I try to do in projects when we had that kind of pass the baton situation. It's really, really important that the new person kind of don't lose momentum because either they don't understand it or they don't know they have the mandate to do this.
Or you
So
accompany them so they can hit the ground and kind of.
exactly, and they
Yeah.
they 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 feel like they are capable, and yes, I'm given the mandate to do this,
Right.
because
Uh-huh.
is many times, no matter how experienced somebody can be, but it's more about feeling like, yes, you have, this is the area that you need to be doing working
Mhm.
on, and having that kind of assurance. So I do think they are quite crucial, so I'm really glad you had that as your trump card, champions.
Couldn't have
So,
been a better card.
yes,
Soledad, I'm conscious of time, just not, but I really, really like how this all came together and it actually took us in a direction of reflection and discussion here that maybe we wouldn't have, discussed, like
totally.
the time component, for example. What I did get, thank you so much for all those insights and sharing your experience. And it's really interesting to see that, you see that there's a pattern regardless of context,
Yeah.
right? Human beings are the same in the end, and that's very interesting because the tool that you use is a storytelling tool, right? Video cameras. By putting people at the back of the camera, in front of the camera, actually they control the whole process, which actually creates trust and renewed engagement or continued engagement. So that's one element that I took away from what you said. I've also put some notes there in terms of participation takes time, but the investment is recouped throughout the length of the process. I also took away the importance, and I think this applies to any process, whether you're using video cameras as a tool or any other tool for community engagement, is anchor it in existing community systems and context, not reinventing the wheel, trying to see what exists and what can actually hold it and take it forward. And I think this is the important also part where you brought in the champions and what the gatekeepers is. Those institutions can also have those gatekeepers for us that can open doors or explain a process that maybe not readily. And then the last point here is about that kind of geographical context is the applicability across contexts, and the length of time of engagement and preparation may be different, but in the end it's the same thing. It's
Yes.
that people, you give a tool so people can tell their stories, can listen to them, and see that they're not distorted, they're not used for.
Manipulated or overly edited, and they are really like speaking face to face like we are doing now in a
Exactly.
direct conversation, just that not always all stakeholders can do that in a project, so video is like a mediation of that conversation, totally.
Yeah. And
The only thing I wanted to say is, like, the only context where these would not work is when there is not a possibility of having conversations. So when we work in context where either conflict is ongoing.
Mm.
We always ask the partners to think about that aspect. So in terms of your geographic context, that would be, you always have to do absolutely risk assessments to
Mm.
understand that you're adding value and you're not doing harm. So
Mhm.
if groups are at a stage where they can have these conversations, and when they are, then it's an extremely useful tool. But that's really important because it's a group process, and it's not necessarily like a one-to-one like you would do in an interview. So
Yeah.
people have to be able to freely talk in front of each other, even if it's in a safe space and under certain conditions.
Mm.
We have supported an organization a couple of years ago to do the first advocacy processes with PV and
Mhm.
communications in
Mhm.
Syria and for
Yeah.
MNE as well. And they're doing amazing. But basically, it's really important they are really embedded in the community, really understand what are the yes and what are the no's, and what are the borderlines and where to work. So I think that's really, really important. But also at the same time, when to pull out, when you should not do this,
Mhm.
and understand that at those stages you need to find another tool. There are a lot of participatory methods. So I always say to people, you don't need to go to do a survey because you cannot use video. There are lots of options to still engage people in conversations, but maybe what is not safe is just to use video or to use photography, and you can use arts. For example, in the Rohinga response, it was not safe to use cameras. So
Right.
we did processes mostly with arts and drama and movement and other things, that it was safe enough for people to reflect on issues without a camera. So I'm saying you need to assess in each context
Absolutely. Yeah.
where you are adding value, and you can fulfill a lovely process
Mhm.
without putting anybody at risk.
Yeah.
I would say
Yeah,
that's
yeah. It's kind of the do no harm, because sometimes
yeah,
it's there's an ethical and a kind of responsibility as well.
totally.
So well, thank you so much for this. This opens up, actually, this could be a whole other conversation. And I can
Yes.
see, even the tokenistic, you said we don't do tokenistic participation. It's so interesting to discuss, and so useful to discuss those things, because actually sometimes, you have people present in these processes because the authorities don't trust. So they put someone in, it's tokenistic in terms of process of engagement, right? But at the same time, you wouldn't be able to have them. So it's kind of that balancing
So
act.
is how you, when you spot that in the
Yes.
participant selection, we call it, then is how you compensate it, and is the negotiation of engaging others, either in a story gathering or in the
Mhm.
screenings, so you make sure that the other stakeholders can participate. I think that's a key role of the champions with allies or organizations that are working with them, not to kind of do something that replicates
Right.
power dynamics,
Hmm.
really. Yeah,
Exactly,
totally.
exactly. Be very mindful of that. Uh,
Totally.
anyway, so yeah, thank you so much. This was a fantastic conversation.
Pleasure.
Very, I learned so much, and it made me think of other similar experiences with other tools, but in similar contexts, right? So it's really
Yes, that's why I always say, participatory media is a tool, but actually the dynamics are really similar to any process where you are wanting to do something with a participatory nature. In
mm,
case of M&E, participatory M&E, some people call it collaborative evaluation, empowerment evaluation, lots of different names in the evaluation sector. But I would say is really that in nature, where you're supporting people go through all the process rather than just answer questions. So we can keep talking for another session. We can do that, but no, and
maybe I'll
um,
call you. I'll call you
I
again.
really hope people get to use the cards. I don't know if you want to
Mhm.
edit that or keep it in. But I do think personally, as having used them in some key moments where I felt it can change the conversation if people are either too stuck or they
Mm,
feel constrained of what they can say and what they cannot, what they are
mm,
allowed, what they cannot, in a safe space like a workshop where they know it's not being recorded or anything.
right.
Really, you can have these kind of conversations. Maybe as I share the way we work, I we don't mind saying anything public, whatever I say. But other organizations may restrict a little bit more people what they can say, what they cannot say. So these kind of cards to me are sometimes this. You brought in a card that you wouldn't have thought about talking,
Yes.
and then it's so crucial to focus on that issue and how important that is
Yeah.
in that project, particularly that you're discussing, or that topic.
Mm.
And it really guides you that maybe somebody wouldn't have brought it up because it was the elephant in the room, or because they thought it's too risky to talk about it. So I think it's a little bit helping people overcome sometimes that, and sometimes just guide you in a different way that is fun as well, really.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons actually I did develop them. It was to democratize actually speech within organization, because I noticed when I traveled to field offices, a lot of the people with the dust on boots, the closest to our beneficiaries, they had the most experience, but they're never invited at strategic
Yes,
conversations or even at project design sessions. And so that's why I really wanted to do that, because you can make it face down. Face down, it really opens up. You have no idea. The randomness of the pick is gonna
totally.
determine what you're gonna talk about. And then face up is actually more intentional. We are going to talk about this because we never talk about this, because it's an issue. For example, time. We're always late with our delivery. There's a process with our procurement processes,
Yes.
like, so.
Oh, you don't tell me. Every time someone has to procure cameras because they do want to buy cameras for their field office. Oh, really few examples where they can streamline that process. Yeah, is a hard one. Procurement.
Yeah, no, exactly. So that's why I developed them. So I'm glad that you're noticing. Even if you use them for just to just start off a session, open up the options, and or even more intentionally to kind of guide a conversation like we did right now.
Yeah,
It's very versatile. It's just cards. You do with
totally.
them whatever. It's so thank you so much for your time, for
No
joining me
pleasure.
on this conversation to kind of rethink social change. And I hope I'll invite you again. I'm so looking forward to that.
Oh, and I can't wait to watch others as well.
Yeah,
It's
thank
super,
you,
super
Soledad.
great. Take care.
Thank you for joining me for another episode of Rethink Social Change podcast. I hope you got a lot of value and actionable insights from today's show. Would love if you take a minute to leave us a review. And if you work on social change and are up for the challenge, reach out. And before you go, be sure to subscribe so you're the first to know when we release a new episode. Till then, be the change.